Welcome everyone. We are very delighted to have with us today Professor Jennifer Gordon. She will be speaking on forced labor at the intersection of trade and immigration. We're even more happy to host this event as it aligns with two of our main research areas here at the Bonavero Institute, namely business and human rights and modern slavery and human rights. Especially with regards to the latter, I would like to highlight that the Bonavero is one of the 6 partner institutions comprising the UK Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Centre. And it's indeed a great pleasure to see among us today several people that have worked with us in the past in the context of our work strand for the Centre. A few words about our speaker. Jennifer has been a professor at Fordham University School of Law since 2003. That's right, Jennifer. Yeah. She's teaching immigration law and labor and employment law. She has written extensively on immigration, trade, and labor standards in the context of globalization, both in academic journals. I'll just highlight here her book, Suburban Sweet Shops, The Fight for Immigrant Rights, that was published with Harvard University Press, but as well as in media outlets. Earlier in her career, she founded and directed the Workplace Project, a pioneering immigrant workers center in the United States. And she has received a MacArthur Prize Fellowship and an Open Society Fellowship. And she has been named one of the outstanding women lawyers in the United States by the National Law Journal. So she will be joined today as a discussant by Mayan Niesna, who is our postdoctoral research fellow in modern slavery and human rights here at the Bonavero Institute, and a fellow of the Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Center. Mayan's research focuses on trafficking for labor exploitation and the regulation of labor migration. She holds a PhD in law from Kent Law School, Master's in Human Rights from the London School of Economics, and an LLB in Law and Philosophy from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I'll just mention here that Jennifer's talk and Mayan's response to it will be recorded, but we will not be recording the Q&A. So that's all. That's for the housekeeping. And the floor is yours, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you, Christos, for the lovely introduction. So I want to talk today about 2 settings that are familiar to most people, I think, who work in the field of business and human rights, or people who specifically focus on modern slavery or forced labor. And that's product supply chains and the risk factors for forced labor in that context. And then temporary migration programs, which I'm going to describe as human supply chains for reasons I'll explain in a moment, and the forced labor risk factors in that context. And it's common to think of those 2 things as completely, completely separate, right? Product supply chain, human supply chain, they live in 2 different worlds. And each commonly is thought of as raising distinct concerns about the treatment of workers. So we think about child labor in the context of garment manufacturing or resource extraction. We think about human trafficking in the context of migration. But I want to focus today on the sites where these 2 things intersect and what we can learn from the sites where they come together. And I want to do that by drawing on my research into export manufacturing in 3 distinct settings: in Jordan, in Thailand, and in Malaysia. All of these are countries that have invested heavily in export zones. You might have heard them called free trade zones or special economic zones. For our purposes today, all the same thing. They're locations where governments seeking to attract foreign investment in manufacturing for export offer special terms to businesses that locate or source from there. So that may include low taxes or no taxes, same with tariffs, reduced costs for access to infrastructure. But to those, and those are the typical elements. To those elements, the governments, in my cases, have added one more powerful inducement to manufacture. And that is, rather than, or in addition to, their own citizens as a labor force, they've arranged for the importation of migrants as migrants from a lower wage country as employees for export firms in these zones. And the risks of forced labor are heightened where these two supply chains meet. Some of you may be familiar with one high-profile example of where this has happened, which is in the medical glove supply chain in Malaysia. The Modern Slavery and Human Rights Policy and Evidence Center has done important work both documenting that problem and assessing the proposed solutions to it. But rather than focus on one case, I want to step back and highlight the structural dynamics in a broader sense that have created the impetus to hire migrants across export industries in Malaysia and across other countries as well. And I want to show a few slides, and Aradna, if you could put them up, and walk through the role of brands and retailers in bringing the product and human supply chains together in the way that I've mentioned. And then I'm going to turn to the question of solutions with a particular focus on the trade regime. So let's see if this works. Okay, so we have a brand in country A, could be a retailer, but we'll just have an imaginary coat brand, and it wants to produce its coats somewhere outside of country A. Country A, let's imagine, is in the global north, and it's looking at possibilities. And it has a range of different countries it could pick from, and eventually it picks country B. Now, in country B, or rather, in the relationship between the brand in country A and the factory in country B, there are some classic what I would call product supply chain forced labor risk factors. In supply chains, as most of you I'm sure know, the lead firm, a brand or a retailer, wants the cheapest product possible as fast as possible, consistent with quality control. And to that end, it exerts downward pressure on wages, because that's one of the few areas where there's a margin that countries can compete with each other based on. And it also demands a fast turnaround of high volume orders. And both of these things translate into risk for workers who then are required to work irregular and often very high hours for very low pay. Now, inside country B, that's where we are now. This is a close-up on country B. As I've described, governments often create special zones within which export manufacturing takes place. And they staff those zones classically with their own citizens. But there's a separate set of forced labor risk factors that occur within zones like this. And they're the result of the enclosed nature and special legal regimes set up for those zones. So often workers' rights are limited within the zone, particularly freedom of association, the right to form and join trade unions, but sometimes also lower wages are set within the zones, higher permissible working hours, and so on, compared to work outside the zones. And critically, employer control is amplified within the zone. And in turn, these are particular risk factors for coercion, control, and forced labor. Whoops. Okay, so there we have zoom out, country B. But country B, the state, the government, is always aware that there are other places that the manufacturer could go to make the manufacturer's coats. And in the search to remain competitive, particularly if country B is on a development trajectory where wages are going up, one of the few places that the government can look is to replacing its own workers. I don't know, Aradna, is that visible to people, or is the black box in the, there we go. To replacing its own workers with some other workforce. And that's how migration comes into the picture. Where would the other workforce come from? It would come from an even lower wage country C. Now, I want to look a little more closely at what's going on within country C. And this is what I refer to as the human supply chain. There is a mirror of the product supply chain going on when migrants are recruited from their home countries and sent to work elsewhere, including when they're sent to work in export zones. And so you see the sort of lead recruiter at the top, intermediaries, and there are often multiple levels structured in multiple ways. And finally, at the bottom, the recruiter who has the contact with particular groups of workers. This human supply chain has its own forced labor risk factors, and they're really in two parts. One takes place during recruitment, and I want to highlight these here. The recruiters often provide inaccurate, if not fraudulent, information about what the pay will be, what the characteristics of the job will be, and so on. They often charge fees, even when fees are illegal. There are bribes or blackmail that sometimes result in money having to be paid beyond fees. And then there are just the costs of migration, right? What it costs to get from one country to another, to deal with the documents and so on. Those two things, migrants' expectations inflated by false promises and the money that they're willing to pay to access the imagined benefits. There are real benefits financially of migration, but they are inflated through fraud, leads to enormously high levels of debt. And those high levels of debt, in turn, generate tremendous fear that people will not be able to complete the migration cycle. They won't be able to finish the job and therefore pay back the debt and begin earning money. Okay, so there we have, back to our full diagram, and we see workers from country C end up as the labor force in country B. Here's a close-up of that. And here's the second half of the human supply chain forced labor risk factors. Those high levels of debt and resulting fear relate on arrival to the fact that almost invariably these visas for low-wage workers are tied to a single employer, and that employer, if the employer fires the worker for asserting her rights, she no longer has the right to remain and work in the country. And so that is a mechanism of coercion, where workers already are afraid and then know that any protest is going to almost automatically result in the revocation of their right to continue earning legally in the country. So this is just to illustrate the combination of the three sets of forced labor risk factors that I've just highlighted. Those that come from the product supply chain, those that arise from the features of export processing zones, and those that are the function in two parts of the dynamics of the human supply chain. All of these, I would just emphasize, are structural factors, right? They are the context within which this economic activity takes place, as opposed to the result of some bad actor, going off of the scheme. This is the scheme. We're looking at the scheme. So there we go. Just the dynamic as a whole as we zoom out, and then around that, I'm done with the PowerPoint. We can get rid of it. So the question is how we address forced labor when, as a result of the risk factors in these contexts, it arises. And here, I think we have some pretty clear lessons about what an effective intervention looks like from the business and human rights realm to tackle this kind of risk. And I would note that the lessons, although they're usually discussed in terms of product supply chain risk, are equally applicable for the risks that arise in the human supply chain. And here's what I would say those lessons are. We need enforceable commitments by the lead firm to eradicate abuses in both supply chains, from their tier one suppliers, their direct suppliers, all the way down to home workers, because there are often multiple levels of subcontracting, accompanied by payments from the lead firm to contractors that are sufficient to cover all the increased costs this entails. And I say that slowly and deliberately because it is key and almost universally ignored, right? You may see all the other elements of what I'm saying are the key lessons, but money changing hands from the lead firm to those who actually have to pay the workers more and treat them better is a rare component of this kind of scheme. Violations have to face meaningful economic penalties, and workers and their organizations should be an integral part of the process of setting the standards and monitoring compliance. So, easy for me to summarize those lessons, hard to find many examples in the real world where they are implemented. There are some of what we call worker-driven social responsibility schemes. Examples often given are the Bangladesh Fire and Safety Accord, the Fair Food Program in agriculture in the United States. But there's only a few of them, and fundamentally brands could walk away from these at any time. They are essentially voluntary schemes. So if we're going to scale up business and human rights and ensure that it has a meaningful impact, it has to be embedded in an ecosystem of regulation that goes beyond voluntariness and goes beyond transparency, which is another hallmark of the scheme, to the imposition of economic consequences on brands for violations that drive the conditions under which migrants and other supply chain workers labor. Now, there are, as everybody in this room I'm sure knows, recent innovations in due diligence legislation in the EU and the UK, which are intended to partially address this. But they retain the focus on requiring transparency rather than requiring and demanding certain outcomes. So my question today is whether the trade regime has anything to add here. That's an old topic. Do trade and labor standards relate in any way? But it's recently receiving new attention from policymakers in the United States, the UK, Australia, the EU, and so on. So I want to begin that part of the conversation by explicitly reframing what I've just described as a meeting of the product and human supply chains as places where trade meets immigration. Host countries in the global south are competing with other low-wage countries for manufacturing jobs at the bottom of the global supply chain. That's trade. And to do so, they're turning to workers from other countries. That's immigration. Like the human and product supply chain, trade and immigration are generally talked about as if they were two separate phenomena that proceed on parallel tracks or tracks off in the distance from each other, depending on whose perspective, but always in that separate way, right? So from the perspective of a corporation, you might move production abroad to take advantage of cheaper labor, trade, or you might hire immigrants at home who are cheaper than citizen workers, migration. From the perspective of a worker, you might seek out jobs at home created by trade, right? There's a lot of talk about trade and its development potential, or you might migrate abroad in search of work. From the perspective of national governments and international governance, there are completely separate regimes to manage migration and trade. But of course, I've just described cases where the railroad tracks, instead of running alongside each other, hit each other in the middle. Where what states are doing when they bring in migrants as export manufacturing workers is to compete for trade by lowering labor costs through immigration. And when they do this, they make it possible for brands and retailers to carry out what I call double labor arbitrage. That is to say, moving production to country B, and then again, without having to move, actually, lowering costs again by hiring migrants from country C in that country. Now, the complicated thing here is that the idea that countries should be able to compete for trade based on labor costs is fundamental to trade, right? To the trade regime, to the existence of trade. If we had no inequality of wages, we wouldn't, in the main, have trade, at least in terms of manufacturing, right? There's always products that are native to one country or the other, but the kind of trade I'm talking about that's based on low-wage manufacturing wouldn't exist if wages were all the same. And since David Ricardo 200 years ago, trade theory has been built on the premise that lower labor costs represent a comparative advantage in trade for less developed countries. The assumption is low wages are a natural occurrence. They grow out of the lower cost of living and lower productivity in less developed countries, and therefore lower wages are not only legitimate, they're celebrated as an engine for competition in trade. But in the sites I've just described, we see low labor costs that are anything but natural. Responding to the demands of governments at the top of global supply chains, governments are constructing, not finding, but constructing a comparative advantage in labor out of whole cloth by importing workers from somewhere else, a process that is, of course, completely artificial. And I should note here also that there are other ways than through immigration that governments have responded to the demand for lower wages from brands. For example, by relying on women as opposed to men as export manufacturing employees, or on internal migrants, rural to urban or rural to zone, rather than migrants from another country, in order, in both cases, also to lower the price that manufacturers have to pay for workers. And I just want to note here a book just out by Dev Nathan and Shika Silliman Bhattacharjee called, the book is anything but boring. The title is Reverse Subsidies in Monopsony Capitalism. But the book is fascinating and I think has its finger on the pulse of exactly what's going on here. And they note how this downward pressure in supply chains has pushed wages below the cost of the minimum needed for a decent life in India and many places in Asia. And this is the crux of their argument. They argue that workers in those countries are being forced to work for less than it costs them to live and reproduce their labor power, and that workers are thus providing a reverse subsidy to brands, right? We usually think of governments subsidizing good things. This is workers subsidizing through their bodies and unpaid labor or low paid labor, the profits of brands. So the idea of an artificial construction of comparative advantage in labor calls into question the line we've drawn to date in trade policy between legitimate and illegitimate competition based on labor costs, and raises the question of when and whether the trade regime should respond to downward pressure on wages. Now, of course, this is the old debate I was alluding to, the question of whether we should have trade sanctions against products produced in violation of core labor standards. And that at the World Trade Organization level was a fight that those in favor of labor standards lost 20 years ago. And as a result, the World Trade Organization doesn't penalize even the worst forms of child labor, trafficking, or modern slavery. But today, most bilateral and regional agreements require compliance with core ILO, International Labor Organization conventions, including banning forced labor, and increasingly they require compliance with the domestic labor regulations of the trading partners as well. The problem here is that enforcement is rare and the level of wages remains off the table in most cases. So the most recent development in this field is the forced labor import ban, or at least the most recent hot topic in this field. And a forced labor import ban is a unilateral provision through which a government can, if it chooses, target a particular product, company, industry, or region by seizing goods that are sought to be imported into the country, made with forced labor. The US is usually recognized as having the lead in this. It has really begun to activate its forced labor import ban in the past 2 years only, and it has been encouraging and independently, also other governments have been coming to this. At the moment, the UK, the EU, and Australia are all considering forms of the same thing. So I want to say a few words about both hopes and concerns for forced labor import bans. I do think that with some major caveats, they have the potential to be an important tool in the arsenal to combat forced labor at the intersection of human and product supply chains. And what I'm most hopeful about, or what I would most like to see developed about them, is that they may be able, I think, to avoid some of the problems of traditional trade sanction regimes, which target governments rather than firms. Countries in the global south have long objected to trade sanctions for labor standards as a protectionist move by global north companies and governments. And I think these objections are quite entirely fair. The forms of wage suppression that I've just described are driven by the demands of global brands. And it seems fundamentally unjust to subject governments in the global south, on the one hand, to those pressures unabated, and on the other, to create a requirement that they raise wages to the point where they lose out in the competition for trade. And what I would love to see forced labor import bans do, and what they could be used to do, is to target lead firms in the supply chain rather than entire countries' industries, and thus shift the pressure to the lead actor in the supply chain off the state in the global south. And now here come the caveats. At the same time, forced labor import bans are going to have to be applied with care in order to truly target structural pressures leading to worker exploitation, including in the context of migration. In the US, which, as I said, is the leader in terms of action here, the majority of times forced labor import bans have been activated. It has been with foreign policy concerns at the core. More than 50%, I believe, have been used against Chinese regions and products. And secondarily, they have been used in the US to target non-US supply chains, right, with non-US brands at the top. It's essential, in my view, and not yet clearly happening, that bans be deployed strategically by governments in a way designed to impact the behavior of lead firms in the countries that enact the bans. In other words, the brands and the retailers from that country that create the dynamic that leads to forced labor, as opposed to primarily serving foreign policy goals or singling out bad actors from other countries. Because, of course, the bad actor approach reinforces the idea that the problem is the problem of the global south, brought about by the global south, and results from malfeasance, right? Some renegade company that is doing this criminal wrong thing, as opposed to the more accurate understanding that the drivers of the problem are located in the global north and create structural pressures across the board, affecting not just a few bad apples, but all actors below lead firms in the supply chain. So finally, and moving beyond the questions related to immigration specifically, I want to urge us to expand our notion of the problem for which forced labor import bans and other tools are a necessary response. Beyond the worst situations of modern slavery, where we've to date been most comfortable having the conversation, to all situations in export manufacturing where pressure from the brand at the top has reduced pay at the bottom to a level insufficient to support a human life with dignity, and places where, as a result, as Nathan and Silliman Bhattacharjee describe in their book, where workers are providing a reverse subsidy to firms. To do this is going to require a culture shift in the world of business and human rights and the world of trade, each of which have tended to accept as fair wages that are legal in the host country, but too low to support human flourishing. And in light of the dynamics that I've outlined today, I think, and the strong evidence that they work to the great harm of workers and the great profit of firms, I believe that's a culture shift that's long past due. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jennifer, for this very thorough talk. Before giving the floor to Maya to respond, I would like to check with you. Is this the book that you're referring to?
It is.
Okay, so I'm going to post it in the chat.
Yes. Yes, just out.
Excellent. So Mayan, now you have approximately 15 minutes to respond.
Okay, I'm going to keep it shorter than that. So thank you so much for this fascinating talk, and I have the privilege of also reading the paper, so I'm cheating a bit in some of my comments, but I am going to try to keep it brief. We have some fantastic people here and online, and I want to leave plenty of time for comments and discussions, and there are some things I'd like to follow up and highlight. My first comment is on the notions of freedom and unfreedom, as in free trade zones and unfree labor of migrant workers. And Professor Gordon's paper is a great demonstration of how the law constructs both of these freedom and unfreedom, that there's nothing natural about it. And it's not just the market in action, it's a regime actively taking certain measures in shaping policies to the needs of powerful economic actors. And there are several reasons this is interesting. One of them is that in popular discourse, we have some idea, some notion of freedom that is presented in a very different way, of workers being free to take or leave jobs, and corporations as free as long as the government does not regulate them. But in this context, we remind that workers are not free, and their lack of freedom is not something that the government fights against. It's not something the government protects from. It's something that the government itself facilitates. Key elements of the workers' unfreedom mentioned earlier, the restriction to a specific workplace, the binding to an employer, the binding to unacceptable conditions are products of the legal system. And it's also interesting the sort of reverse idea of freedom regarding the market or the manufacturers, that the zones and the markets and the production, they are free to operate in this very profitable manner due to government intervention that enables their operation, not because the government is absent. So there's an interesting angle for this freedom label. What is the role of legal regimes in shaping or combating unfreedom? What is the relationship between the law and freedom, freedom from and freedom to, in this context where we could see both of these elements, which is really interesting. And there's an interesting question of when we use this word, when we talk about free as in market and free as in labor, are we using the word free or unfree in a consistent way? That I think this brings out, and it's really interesting. This demonstration of legal construction also raises the question of the relationship between the market and the nation state in restricting migrant workers' freedom. To what extent we conceive an idea of migrant workers needing one of these powerful actors to protect them from the other, and to what extent it really happens, and to what extent we actually have two very powerful actors or powers working together against migrants. And if this is the case, do we need a third power? And then there's a question of what this third power is, whether this is in collective action or something else, and whether collective action or something else, how can this be facilitated? A related point from the legal production of precarious status in enforced labor is there's something very visible here, because this situation lacks many of the defenses and justifications we see in the context of just migration or single labor arbitrage. They do not apply here. And important tension that can be recognized in various contexts of labor migration is the relationship between profit and hostility, or between capitalism and nationalism. When the work itself is desirable, the workers are not. And the market calls for more migrants in larger sectors, lower wages, and for longer periods, and the national interest or migration control interest calls for more restrictions, exceptions, reducing the numbers, shortening the periods of stay. And this point is interesting in the specific context of special economic zones, because just there's another layer of arbitrage for the company's labor arbitrage, there's another layer of exclusion for the migrants who are even one step further away from the host society, which is interesting thing here in this dual relationship between nationalism and capitalism at play. There's also something you mentioned earlier, this noteworthy lack of a key justification. If in the normal ideas of zones, the justifications for all of these exceptions from regulations and labor protection and environment protection and taxation is that they create job in a place that really needs them. There's this remunerated activity. And here, this justification is just not convincing because the jobs are yet another thing taken from the host society with nothing in return, emphasizing the question of why, what is it good for, what are the principal justifications, and what are the actual powers pushing and pulling around this. And I know that you address some aspects of this in the paper. For me, it would be great to hear more about it, what other justifications, other explanations that could be offered. And my third and final point is about temporariness. And here again, the special situations of the zones with various considerations and justifications removed, it helps see something that is not just limited to zones. It draws attention to things that we see definitely in the context of migration and to some extent in the context of trade or development. And this is the question of permanent temporariness. There's a story that we're being told about how a particular system is only a temporary step. It's the starting point. It's very limited, low-skilled, low-paid jobs. But this is temporary because at some point the zones, and you address it in the paper, they will be transformed into this high-skilled technology that will be attractive for other reasons. And it's only a matter of time. But as you demonstrate in this paper, this doesn't happen, or it's definitely not the paradigm case. What we see instead is the zones are going to be more sophisticated and more rewarding for the companies, and yet the poor aspects remain. And to maintain them, there's the introduction of new measures, new facilities, move to migration. So the host society, and I think there's even a question whether the notion of host society really applies here, to what extent it's a host society, it gains even less without a job. And it's interesting in the intersection of trade and migration. But it's also interesting that this notion of temporariness, only a step in the way to something bigger and better, more productive or more equal, it's a story we see in both of these contexts separately, and we see it in the intersection. And it's an interesting story, interesting, very specific look or narrative of what is progress that is either very optimistic or very cynical. And when looking at this intersection with migration, and I keep talking about stories, but there are lots of stories we tell, and it's an interesting case study of how these stories actually work, what do they reflect. And it's a story we know from many migrant receiving contexts. So in the UK, there's a great example in the works of Bruce and Anderson on the introduction of labor migration as something temporary that once introduced, it's hard to move on. There's almost an addiction of a sector growing to rely on labor migration. And there's a promise of temporary step towards better permanent arrangement that is never delivered. And it seems from these cases, it's never delivered in these contexts. So thank you very much for sharing this paper.
Thank you, and thank you for this.
Thank you very much, indeed. Jennifer, I can give you 5 minutes to respond, and then we can open the floor for comments and questions.
Great. And maybe I'll just respond to one piece of that very rich set of comments, and hope we have a chance to come back to some of the others later. And that is what I think is the very core question of, if the jobs aren't going to the citizens of the country in which the zone is located. What are they getting out of this? Well, what's the impetus here? And that is something I've given a lot of thought to, and that I think actually the way to answer that is to ask them, right? Like, I think to answer that responsibly, I need to begin interviewing government officials who are responsible for these decisions, because I can only speculate. So let me speculate, right? Since I haven't yet done that. So if their workers aren't getting the jobs, what are the governments getting, right? One possibility, Mayan just knocked out of the ballpark, which maybe that's not the right metaphor, but in any case, Mayan just refuted, which is the idea that if you begin with low-wage zones, there will be an arc of progress, that these sort of low-tech, labor-intensive zones will transition over time to high-tech, high-skill zones that will employ your own workers and with good jobs. And I have looked at what I at this point think has to be all the literature on this. How often is that happening? What kind of returns are governments seeing? And with some exceptions that seem to be unique in the sort of the economics, the geography, and the politics of them, that is not a common narrative. That a country that starts an export zone with the goal of attracting, the great high-tech element of export work will be able to get there by beginning with low-wage manufacturing. That transition very rarely seems to happen. And there are some cases, particularly in Asia and particularly a while ago, where countries did seem to be able to make that transition, and that in the main has not proven replicable for other countries seeking to follow that model. And so I think Mayan is completely right in noting that progress story, the progress narrative, is not a narrative on which we can rely. And then there's the possibility, often held out, of what are called backward and forward linkages. That is to say, the idea that work in zones, the backward linkage would be, it would draw on raw materials, production, labor, and so on present in the country. Forward linkages, that it would lead to this kind of skill transfer and technological advance. Again, there are exceptions, but that is not the mainstream story here. I think the most convincing hypothesis is a sort of international signaling that the zones for so long have been the standard way for a less developed country to signal that it's ready to get into the game of the global economy. And that even though some of the institutions, such as the World Bank, that have encouraged this, themselves have studied the phenomenon and come up with much more complex assessments of whether this works or doesn't, they remain a way for a government to say that it's ready to take up the advice of the top economic experts of the world and compete at a global level. And I think particularly, for example, of Ethiopia here, which is one of the latest entrants into the garment supply chain anyway. And where, although the government has invested tremendously in new garment production zones and in trying to bring companies in, there have been tremendous obstacles in actually attracting investment for all kinds of reasons that we can talk. I'm happy to talk about them, but we don't need to talk about them right now. Despite those challenges, at least in the absence of actual evidence that I would gain from really going to people who are making these decisions, I think that a signaling function and the hope that the country will be able to beat the historical record are probably the drivers.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And now we'll conclude the recording part of this event. So I invite those in person, but also those online to give their comments, feedback, questions. For those online, please raise your digital hands and then we'll give you the floor to unmute yourselves after I call you. Is it possible, Aradhana, to do that? Okay.